everyone could join us here today. MSAC is pleased to welcome representatives of the Coalition to Protect the Missouri River. Dan Engemann is the director, and he's based out of Hermann, Missouri. And joining him is David Shorr, a board member. And both gentlemen serve as members of the Missouri River Recovery Implementation Committee. And he represents agricultural interests, and Shorr represents waterway industries. And what we've asked Coalition to Protect the Missouri River to join us here today is to visit, in general, what life is like along the Missouri River south of Gavins Point Dam. I think it's really easy for us to really become localized, and of course we're going to be concerned about what's outside our front door in our backyard. But as we learn about trying to address sedimentation, address flood control, and so forth, we realize we're along a river that has impacts upstream, downstream. We're not localized. So I think it's really important for us to learn more about the issues downstream and how we can potentially work together and find common ground and see what things we can forge ahead, whether it's legislation or other activities. But we'll turn it over here to Dan.
Okay, thanks, Sandy. Can everybody hear me okay? Sandy, I think it's working fine. Well, thanks for joining this afternoon. Again, my name is Dan Engemann, Director of the Coalition to Protect the Missouri River. I'll talk a little bit about the group next, but I just want to thank you for your time and dedicating a little bit of your afternoon with all the craziness in the world right now, and the fact that you're choosing to spend some time with us and learn about this set of issues. And so don't be afraid to ask questions. We'll try to hold the questions till the end, unless someone's got a burning question or needs some clarification or something. And if you direct all your really tough questions to David Shorr, I'd appreciate it. So he's what I call the brightest mind on the Missouri River. Let's just put it this way: I haven't found one better. So David would be able to help quite a bit. And it's like, how they do the pop songs where you have the artist and then featuring someone else. So I'm featuring David Shorr here, talking about commercial sand dredging, as he represents those companies in a legal regulatory context. But so anyway, we just about our group, we support responsible Missouri River management, maintenance, and enhancement of congressionally authorized purposes. So we talk about the authorized purposes. I think pretty well everyone knows, but I'll rattle those off real quick. Flood control, navigation, irrigation, water supply, water quality, recreation, fish and wildlife, and hydropower. We also support properly balanced, science-based habitat restoration for an threatened species. So we didn't think it needs to be a zero-sum game, that we can do both. People can live and work along the Missouri River, and also that we can restore the species along the river. So hopefully I'm getting a message here. My internet connection is maybe a little unstable. I'm not sure, but Sandy, you let me know if there's problems here. We have a 30-member coalition across 6 states made up of flood control, navigation, and utility interests, including Mississippi River. So the Missouri River provides 72% of the flow past St. Louis. So that middle Mississippi between St. Louis and where the Mississippi joins the Ohio at Cairo, Illinois. So the Missouri River can be a big factor in make sure we've got steady flow there, especially during times of drought. The Corps can't manage the Missouri River for the Mississippi, but it certainly is interconnected and should be looked at as a system. Our group was formed in 2001. A group of organizations in Missouri banded together to respond to the Missouri River Master Manual changes to protect our interest in that process. There were, that was I'm sure a lot of you know, that was a 15-year endeavor, $25 million. certainly lengthy and expensive. But so, my elevator speech, I sum it up like this. We exist to keep the Missouri River and its corridor open for business, so people can continue to live and work along the river. So today I'll be talking about the various CPMR interests in the lower basin: agriculture, flood control, navigation, utilities, give you an overview of that. We'll talk about the 2019 flood and recovery efforts. We'll talk about Lower Missouri River flood study that's been funded through the Army Corps' budget and related legislation, and as well as some concerns we have with the Missouri River Recovery Program. So, in regard to Lower Missouri River agriculture, I'm going to minimize this screen. Agriculture is the dominant land use in the lower basin. It accounts for up to 72% of river bottom acres. Of the 4 lower river states, Missouri's got the most ag land in the river bottoms, about 676,000 acres. About 67% of our total bottom land is in ag production. When you compare that to the other states, we got other 4 lower states. Iowa's got, you can see here, about 461,000 acres, or 73% of their total land mass. Nebraska, about 219,000, or 59% of the total. In Kansas, it's got the smallest Missouri River shoreline, just that one corner of their state, 25,000 acres, about 46% of the total. I heard Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works, R.D. James, say recently, he met with a group of us in Columbia, Missouri, about how agriculture and navigation go hand in hand. And that's absolutely true. The two are tied together. We got a lot of talk right now about how flood control should be the top priority for everything. But really these two cannot be separated out. And I'll go over a little bit of the history of it. 1945, the Rivers and Harbors Act authorized what's called the Bank Stabilization Navigation Program, or we refer to it as the BSNP, completed in the early 1980s. So this system, the BSNP, is not even 40 years old yet when it was declared complete by the Army Corps. And it established today's 300-foot wide by 9-foot deep self-scouring navigation channel through a series of rock dikes and revetments. So I view this as really an engineering marvel to do this. We hear all the time about the precarious state that our locks and dams are on the Mississippi River. And it's built in the 20s and 30s, and they're undersized, it's in really bad shape. Well, a towboat can get on the Missouri River at St. Louis and go all the way to Sioux City without any locks and dams. So certainly saves time. We don't have to worry about maintaining those kind of things, but we have our own set of maintenance issues with these rock structures that we'll continue to talk about in the presentation. But really the BSNP, what it did was stabilize the banks. And when I say stabilize, I mean setting the channel in place so it doesn't move around from bluff to bluff like it did previously. We still have large amounts of bank erosion, which I know that you all deal with as well in the upper basin. But on the whole, the river channel doesn't move. And so this BSNP allowed sediment to deposit in the land to accrete. They started, some of the first dikes out there were wood pilings. And I think this is my next slide that shows that those go very far into the land. And then so the wood pilings that are in the river right now that are out in the sidebars of the river channel were overlaid with rock over time, to shot rock from quarries. But that is what allows the river to self-scour. And typically, we'll talk about commercial sand dredging, but in terms of dredging for navigation, that's pretty rare, unlike the Mississippi River, where they have to do quite a bit of that. So the lands accreted, creating the fertile bottomlands that we know today. So this is from the Army Corps' navigation chart. So this is a pretty typical chart here of the rock structure. So you can see what's here. I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but the rock, these black lines are rock structures. And this is upriver to downriver. And as you can see, these rock structures extend pretty far landward And of course, they're covered up now with lots of soil, so they're several feet below the soil. But this is what we're talking about. And along this stretch here on what we call the lower, the right descending bank is a rock. This is a rock revetment to keep that bank in place. So agriculture is really personal to me. This is a picture of my family's farm. We've dated this farm back to 1870 when my ancestors came over from Germany. And you can see here in the title, Rhineland, Missouri. So we live in a little German community. So you can see these hills back here on the south side of the river, reminding them of the Rhine Valley in Germany is where they chose to settle. My family, we donated this land way back when for this church to be built, and you can't see it off to the right, but there's a cemetery up on the hill. But I thought it would give you a pretty good idea of what our river bottom looks like this time of year. There's nothing planted yet. Typically, we'll start planting corn in April, early part of April, mid-April, depending on weather conditions. We're really, really wet right now. Our river's over flood stage. So it's kind of more of the same. We had a really wet winter, and fall, spring, just really wet conditions. I'm actually standing on top of one of our grain bins, taking this picture. So that's looking to the west. Our river bottom here isn't really wide. Some areas where you'll find the bottoms are just, several miles long. We're maybe, a mile or 2, 3 wide. We're more a long, narrow district that encompasses about 13,000 acres. And when I talk about a levee district, I'm talking about a land, a tax is assessed by the district to land that's protected by those acres to fund maintenance and construction. So these are our ag levees. This is another one of my family's farms here. This kind of is a little bit of things. So this narrow band right here is the levee. On the other side is a band of trees, and then beyond that is the river. And on this picture to the right, I'm standing on the levee. So it's important when we talk about levees. So right here, there's a lot of talk, a lot of confusion about federal or non-federal levees. So we are in the Corps' PL 8499 program. So that's kind of a mouthful industry jargon. It's from the congressional authorization. But so 80% of the funds used to construct the levee or repair it if it would breach, or we want to do some improvements to the levee, 80% of the funds would be provided by the federal government, and the local district would provide 20% of the funds. So we are governed by the Corps' levee safety program. So they will do periodic inspections of pipes, of drainage pipes, make sure the slopes are intact, make sure that these trees here aren't encroaching on the toe of the levee too much, make sure your levee's not full of burrows from animals, that kind of thing, to make sure it's structurally sound. But most of Missouri is set up this way with PL 8499 cost share levies. When you get in northwest Missouri, maybe parts of Kansas, Iowa for sure, and parts of Nebraska, you deal with 100% federal levies, where the federal government is providing all the financing for that, outside of the normal maintenance that a local district, a local sponsor would have to do. So hopefully that makes sense to draw that distinction. Interior drainage is very, very important. Most of the time when we're flooded, we are flooded more from water seeping under the levees or water that can't escape, more so than a levee overtopping. You can see here, so these two pipes here on the left drain about 6,500 acres, and about 6 feet diameter, something like that. You can see the high water mark from last summer event. So you can imagine that with this, the pipes get overwhelmed with water, and these upright pipes are designed to prevent or to keep airflow going into the pipes so they continue to push that water out. So on the right are what the exterior of the levee looks like. We have a small drainage ditch that goes to the river there, and these are what we call flap gates. You can see here at the bottom, the water is really kind of up to the bottom. Water from inside the levee is continuing to flow through. I would say right now we're 3 feet above flood stage, so probably these pipes are probably completely submerged right now. So you close your flap gates when the water's high, you don't have backflow going inside the levee, and but then open up the gates when the river drops out. So it's all gravity drainage, nothing sophisticated about it at all. Some areas along the Missouri River use pumps, stationary pumps, temporary pumps to pump the water out. You're going to, I think, see more of that as we go forward, especially we're dealing with these really wet years. I know my family's making a sizable investment to put in a stationary pump right now to better be able to handle this water. So this is what I would say is overwhelmed interior drainage from last year. So looking at that, you would think that that is from a levee breach. And so that is the inside of our levee district from water that simply can't go anywhere. You know, stationary pumps would not prevent this, but certainly we could have stayed ahead of it a little better and got the water off sooner. But yeah, this is pretty rare that it happens to this level. We were thankful to keep our levees intact. What happens is you can see these hills on the south side of the river, and we've got, you know, same set of hills on the north side. So all the water running off into the hills, from the hills into the river bottoms, and it just has no place to go. Can't escape to the river. I want to switch gears to Missouri River navigation. So it's kind of interesting. This is also another family member of mine that's involved in commercial sand dredging and long haul navigation. So this vessel is about to pass under the Hermann Missouri River Bridge. So at Hermann, we're 100 miles, roughly 100 miles upriver from the mouth of the Missouri. So we are, just to give you some more context, we're an hour and a half west of downtown St. Louis. So this vessel is carrying 9 barges of soybeans, so about 500,000 bushels. And so just to give you an idea what the Missouri River is capable of. So that's another, so it provides our farmers just another option, another transportation option that can help keep other modes of transportation, other costs of transportation, whether it's rail or truck, keep those prices in check when you have a viable navigation system to also move grain. Just some industry notes on Missouri River navigation. So in 2017, this is the most recent data published by the Army Corps. We moved nearly 5 million tons on the Missouri River, and it's trended upward since 2011. We've got commercial sand and gravel shipments that we'll talk about here in a little bit. 4 million tons, so it makes up the bulk of that navigation. So we have 7 long-haul companies currently operate on the Missouri River, and that's been a pretty new development. In the past, there might have been 1 or 2, but now we've got 7. Cement shipments are going from Kansas City to Omaha, pretty new development there as well. Port KC in Kansas City, Missouri, received over 100,000 tons in 2019, up from 13,000 tons in 2015. So there's new port activity starting at St. Joseph, Missouri, planned improvements at Boonville, Missouri, Central Missouri, Jefferson City. They formed a new port district, St. Charles, Missouri, elsewhere. They're talking, maybe not too distant future, we could have container shipping on the Missouri River as well. There's a group based out of Louisiana that's looking at doing it on the Mississippi River. So maybe at some point in the future, we'll have container shipping. And really, it's all because we've had reliable water for the last few years. That makes all the difference in the world. The towing is already happening. Really haven't missed too much time this year because we've just had a tremendous amount of water. So here's the point to where I want to have David Shorr come in and talk about commercial sand dredging. David, if you're ready.
I'm ready. Can you all hear me? Dan, can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate it. These are odd circumstances right now. This is a picture of Jefferson City, Missouri, which is the Missouri state capital. It sits on the Missouri River. It's about midway through the dredge area. The dredge area extends from rural Nebraska down to the mouth of the Missouri. In this picture, if you look towards the bridge, you'll see a small picture, very small. I wanted to give you context of how we sit with regard to this commodity. As Dan said, we are commodity driven. We are not in the business of dredging the channel to maintain boat traffic. We will if we have to, but generally speaking, we are moving a commodity called sand. If you look upriver from the bridge, you'll see a small dot. Hopefully you can see that that is a dredge. And then downriver, you'll see a barge being towed up to the dredge, and that's how the materials moved. We generally travel only about 10 miles with regard to commercial sand. So we are called a short haul navigator in our business. Dan, you want to switch to the next slide, please?
Yeah.
Okay. You are looking slightly to Jefferson City will be on the left-hand side of your first small screen. And immediately across the river is the largest sand plant in Missouri. This is a sand plant owned by Capital Sand. That is the same tow that is going up towards the dredge. The dredge removes the material from the bottom of the river, and as we continue to get more computer and GIS sophisticated and GPS sophisticated, we now have a more efficient operation in that we can go to historic locations along the river where the river itself acts as the main separator of material and grade. We can actually get Missouri MoDOT specification sands by knowing where in the part of the river those sands will fall out. So we use the river as a machine, and that machine is exceptionally efficient with regard to its currents. The sand plant, as you see there, will move the sand off the river by barge, and it will then be processed more by separating out what's called lignite, which is coal that actually exists in the river bottoms from the standpoint of how it's moved out of actually the northern part of the basin. On the right-hand side of the picture is what it typically looks like from a load basis. And I wanted to give you a perception of the size and scale of these sand piles and how they get worked. It's not a very complicated operation, but it is extremely important with regard to how we make cement in this country. Dan, the next slide, please. Okay, here's a few key points for you. On the left is this picture of a dredge. A dredge does not normally have its own source of navigation power. It is controlled by anchors that are placed into the river, and then it is pulled around by the winches that move it and position it in order to pull material. It's all hydraulically driven. It is all permitted by the Corps of Engineers, and we are going through permitting right now with regard to our next cycle. Our cycles are 5 years, and we are evaluated every 5 years with regard to our operational capability. Commercial sand dredging represents 91% of navigation tonnage on the river. So without the processing of this commodity, you really have a limited amount of long-haul carriage right now. And the mutual goal of all the participants is for our percentage to go down. We want the long-haul navigation. Under formulas, it improves the overall maintenance characteristics of the Missouri River because the system nationwide is designed based upon total amount of net haul tonnage. And as I mentioned, we do not haul far distances versus somebody who's going to come up from New Orleans in order to process material. And so as a direct result, we're somewhat punished because we do a lot of short haul navigation. 75% of construction sands for Missouri projects and in the state of Missouri come from the Missouri River. The remaining 25 come from the Mississippi River and some sands in Oklahoma. But the majority of construction projects, interstates, foundations, major buildings, etc., are coming as a result of the material that's in this river. So it's an important commodity with regard to the state of Missouri and state of Kansas, I should say as well, because the state of Kansas derives a major portion of its sands for concrete from the Missouri River. Dredging takes place by 4 companies, starting just upriver from St. Joe and continue down to the mouth. 3 of them produce in excess of 1.3 million tons a year, and the other one happens to be Dan's cousin, who produces about under a million, but does a good job with regard to small size. 70% of the sediment load that used to be in the Missouri River is now trapped behind your dams. So as a direct result, we get less material in the system, and as a direct result, our impact is proportionally higher because we don't have as much material. The easiest words I can say to you all is we know you have the material, we want it. And however the Corps can manage to get more material in the river would be both helpful from the commodity side and also from the habitat side, because the habitat right now is clearly not the same with regard to its turbidity in the system. Dan, do we have one more on this one, or are we done?
Yeah, I think we're finished up with dredging.
Thanks.
Unless there was a question out there. Okay, thanks, David.
You're welcome.
All right, so we'll keep going. You know, really, I talked about navigation, agriculture going hand in hand, but navigation and all of water supply go hand in hand. We like to say that navigation is an important proxy for all of water supply because it provides that consistent supply for our intakes. So what you got on the screen here right now is what's called a collector well, drinking water collector well, that's owned by Water One Water District from Johnson County, Kansas. So just on the across the river from Missouri, of course. And it's interesting. This is the same collector well. On the lower left is normal conditions, what that looks like, and then the upper right is flood conditions that we experienced last year. And the only way you could get to this well, obviously, was by boat if you need to go out there and check on anything or do any maintenance. So I thought that was kind of pretty interesting comparison of what things look like on the lower river last year. So statistics on this, and this is from the Army Corps and Missouri DNR. So there are 41 total intakes below Gavins Point. So you can see the breakdown: 18 municipal, 12 public, 10 domestic, and 1 commercial/industrial intake. And this is an important note. You know, people think that, you know, why does the Missouri River matter to me? Well, 1/2 of Missouri's population gets its drinking water from the Missouri River. So it's very, very powerful. So you're talking about roughly 3 million people. There's 14 power plants downstream of Sioux City. So this is a picture of the Evergy power plant, coal plant. They're in northwest Missouri that's providing power on a daily basis. I think they're part of the Southwest Power Pool. I'm not an expert in how all that works, but anyway. So again, switch gears, going right through things. The 2019 flood was one for the record books, more so in duration than anything. It's sure a lot of shared pain everywhere in the lower basin, and I know the reservoirs were extremely high. So I'm sure those of you from the upper basin can have plenty of your own stories. But I got a chance to fly over kind of west central Missouri in last July, and then you can see there where there used to be a levee and a row of trees. Is now a lot of the trees are in this farm field and full of sand deposits, and it's really would be remarkable if this field was ever farmed again. It would take quite a lot to remove that sand. You know, farmers are definitely can figure it out. If it can be done, they can reclaim a piece of land, but it'd take a long time to ever get that back into production. So in this upper right, you can see how the Missouri River kind of snakes around and then flows through the middle of that picture. And then on the left-hand side would be the south side of the river is all flooded as well. So really this was, I know there's a lot of really extreme damage in Iowa, Nebraska, really the whole lower basin, but this is some of the worst that I saw personally. So again, my hometown of Hermann, this hydrograph last year occurs through the USGS. So you can see January 19 to current. So this red line here is 21 feet. That's our flood stage. So you can see the March, what the March bomb cyclone did. It spiked that river, and then it goes down for a little bit. And then May, here we go again, another big spike from May to August roughly. Up again in September. It was just a roller coaster event all year. And then back down. January, we saw it spike over flood stage, and now we are over flood stage again. So certainly prohibits any people getting too excited about doing field work or putting on fertilizer, that kind of thing, because you can imagine underneath these bottomlands that I described, that water table is pretty close below the soil, and it certainly fluctuates, and we deal with seep water issues from our ditches and water seeping under the levee. All presents challenges for putting a crop in. So I talked about the record-setting duration. This is from NOAA and the Weather Service. Everyone, I think likes to talk about the flood in 1993, and certainly I remember that really well. And I remember it seemed like a really, really long time. But when you look at the duration compared to 2011 and 2019, it doesn't even, it's not even close. 11 was an interesting event for us in the lower basin in Missouri for certain, because thankfully it did not rain much. We were pretty well in a drought condition in 2011. Otherwise, we would have had much worse problems here in the lower basin. What we did, we basically had a blue sky flood, as everyone probably remembers. Had a tremendous amount of rain in Montana in May, like 17 inches at a time, and all that water came our way. So roughly, to give you some perspective, it takes about a week for water from Gavins Point to get here to east central Missouri and close down to the mouth. But you look here, it's amazing. These gauges from Nebraska City to Waverly, 243, 245 days above flood stage. And if you put up the same chart on Mississippi River, it would be every bit as bad as that, maybe worse. So certainly set some records for duration on Mississippi River too. We'll talk about levee rehab status and what 2019, what that did. This is from the Army Corps as well. 211 total breaches from the 2019 flood. And so 56 federal levees. Earlier in the presentation, I talked about federal versus non-federal levees, and then 155 non-federal breaches. So really kind of highlights what I'm going to talk about here in a little bit about how can we do better for our non-federal units, and what do we need to do going forward, because it certainly seems as bad it happens anywhere, but quite an inequity when you see those side by side like that. So when you look at a levee system, you have 83 different levee systems that were overtopped or breached. As of late February, the Corps had 16 critical breaches closed. So they're really focusing on closing what they call inlet breaches to keep the water in the river and not flowing back into ag lands or river communities. And working on the outlet breaches would be the second priority. But over $1 billion is estimated for a full system repair. To date, the Corps has received $568 million. And they estimate repairs. I think that's very optimistic. Certainly, I hope that they hit that target, but it's all weather dependent. So I think on the whole, people really don't have too many complaints about the status of the levee repairs. I think the Corps is doing a pretty remarkable job for the hand they've been dealt. I want to talk about, again, moving forward, how do we do different? One of the items that was funded with some supplemental budget monies was a lower Missouri River flood study. So this was funded in the Corps' current work plan for fiscal 2020. Currently adheres to Army Corps' 3x3x3 sideboards. Hopefully y'all are familiar with that, but 3 years, $3 million, 3 levels of vertical integration. I don't even know what vertical integration means, but there's some talk about, I think really the Corps would like a 5-year study to do this. But at the end of the day, this is the important part about the Lower River Flood Study, that this isn't going to be a study that says, 5 years from now, we found out that it's flooding a lot of Missouri River. We already know that. This is how can we do some early implementation of projects as we go along. It's interesting, one of the individuals in the Kansas City Core District really believes that if we had this study in place after the 2011 flood, then maybe, just maybe, that we wouldn't be in as bad of a situation in 2019. There's no offense to anyone at the time, but I think people thought, well, we're surely not going to see a flood event like that so close together from 2011. We're going to be hit with one in 2019. So a lot of the energy, I think, went out of the room, but it's a whole different ballgame now. You got the, I'm sure a lot of you have seen, you have the lower 4 state governors that have met several times with the Army Corps. They want a seat at the table. And that's great. They're engaged, and it's good to see, and they're talking with our congressional delegation. But this lower river flood study would be 735 miles from Sioux City to the mouth. It's going to look at previous flood events, updates to like flow frequency models. It's going to evaluate problems, opportunities, and goals. One of the things it's going to look at is, different pinch points or constriction points on the river. Look at structural and non-structural flood control measures, including ways to increase conveyance. We know that some areas you have the river it's areas that are degrading, the bottom is getting lower. You have some areas like, I guess, north of St. Joe, roughly to the Platte River, in the rough ballpark, that the bottom is coming up. It's actually aggrading. So, I was at a meeting I think it was 2 years ago already. Some locals were really upset in Southwest Iowa about the flooding, and some kind of the old timers along the river said, this river used to be able to handle more water than it does today. And there's probably something to it. If the bottom of the river is coming up, I'm not an engineer, but that seems to make sense to me that we need to look at areas like that. It's important that the study is going to avoid impacts to navigation, other authorized purposes, including the BSMP. And I think, we're on this webinar today to talk about the lower versus the upper basin, or give you some more insight. I think there is a general recognition from most people in the room. There is some chatter about, changing the master manual, but our group has been very, very hesitant to do that because, again, it's lengthy, it's expensive. We just don't think we need to get into those fights of the past again. So what we're looking at here is how do we improve things on the lower river without, drastically changing reservoir levels, and really getting into those fights of the past and making everybody mad. Because David would tell you, I think we're seems to be one of the only groups that are saying, before we draw down the reservoirs or whatever that looks like, one, there's a lot of challenges in even doing that. So John Remus would say, with Army Corps that runs the reservoirs, he'd say, when are you going to take the extra water? You'd have to start doing that in the summer to actually accomplish that. You have to do that for a long time, and weather conditions would certainly have to add up. But what do you do in times of drought? I talked about supplying navigation, supplying the intakes. If you're drawing the reservoirs down further, you're putting yourself in a real bind. And it's hard to think of drought right now, but we all know we've seen the script flip way too fast in the past. We had the 2011 flood, for instance, and then followed by the 2012 drought, where they had severe low water conditions on the middle Mississippi River. So things can change really fast, and we need to remember that. So kind of really to complement, I think, the lower Missouri River study that's funded is Senator Blunt's Lower Missouri River Flood Protection Act. This was offered by Senator Roy Blunt from Missouri March 5th, co-sponsored by all lower river senators, which is significant, and really directs the Secretary of the Army to develop a system plan for reducing flood risk and improve resiliency. Again, this would focus on the lower river. After a feasibility report's completed, it gives the authority to the Army Corps to construct projects not exceeding $75 million. Federal cost share be 80% for those projects. The comprehensive plan will consider recommendations of the Pick-Sloan plan, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. That really the Pick-Sloan was developed into the 1944 Flood Control Act. And it really did a lot of things. It would be interesting to see, as far as my estimation, I think there were more reservoirs that were called for. under that plan. There were certainly federal levees that were called for all the way to the mouth in St. Louis for the Missouri River. That's something that we talked recently about with Secretary James about. That's something he said that he wants is federal levees all the way to the mouth, like was originally planned. And it directs the Secretary to study, design, and construct water resource projects, modify completed flood protection to communities along the river. We'll consider, again, the use of structural, non-structural measures where locally acceptable. And I think the part where locally acceptable is really, really key. That's something we've been saying in various forums, that the locals have to have a seat at the table. They know their stretches of the river better than anyone else. And if they don't think it's going to work, then we don't need to do it. You need to pay attention to the locals, people that actually live and work there, own land, and make sure it's something that can work for them. I think blanket statements about moving levees back, one, it's really expensive to do that. And we need to make sure that our flood control is the same for both urban and rural areas. It seems like in a lot of cases, maybe for good reason, that our urban areas, the flood control is more robust. And certainly we think our rural areas are deserving of a robust flood control system as well. $500 million are authorized for planning, design, and construction of projects. So this is be significant if we can get this passed. Kind of want to switch gears again. This is the last point that I want to cover today, and then we'll open it up for questions. But the Missouri River Recovery Program is the overarching program designed to protect the endangered species along the Missouri River. Sandy mentioned David and I's involvement with Mr. Rick. That's the Missouri Recovery Implementation Committee. So that's 70 members from Missouri to Montana on this committee. So we are providing guidance to the Corps and the Fish and Wildlife Service in regarding their programs. Where David and I come in a lot is the human element of things and making sure that human interests aren't compromised during this exercise. And, again, about creating that win-win scenario. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game like I mentioned before. We both. But here is I want to highlight some of our big concerns with the recovery program in terms of this past action here of constructed chutes and a future action that I'll talk about here in a little bit. But constructed chutes, there are over 30 of these constructed by the Army Corps throughout the lower basin. And so the previous record of decision, biological opinion from the Fish and Wildlife Service says we have to have X amount of shallow water habitat per mile along the Missouri River. So they went to cutting these chutes. So these were mechanically dredged. They had a much smaller version of that dredge that you saw earlier go in and cut these chutes. And as you can see, this is one of the toughest bends for our navigators to begin with. The navigators will tell you more times on the Missouri River than not, they're navigating sideways around these bends than going, straight. But you can imagine the water is diverting into this side channel chute, and it's causing shoaling at the top of this bend where the sediment is falling out because the water is becoming slack there. It's not moving as fast. So you're ending up with some shoaling problems. And the navigators would tell you pretty well to a T that's where they're having a lot of the problems out there. It's important. We talked about the Missouri River, being this, it's federally designated as a marine highway. It's the M35. I think I have that right, M70 or M29. But really, if you have one spot, like a lock and dam, that's failed or something or out of commission, you have one spot on the Missouri River that's blocked, it's caused problems for the whole work. So the whole system has got to be reliable. And the Army Corps has done a great job. On the whole, it's a very good system. But you do have a few problem spots like this, and which makes everyone nervous. So these were originally kind of billed to the public as they were necessary for pallid sturgeon recovery. And so the agencies now say, well, these were not built with any pallid sturgeon metrics, which is very disappointing. USACE, they're no longer constructing chutes but I mentioned the diversion of water. So this water is shortcutting the channel. So we're working very hard. We're recommending that they improve the control structures at the top of these chutes, and you can still serve backwater areas for pallid sturgeon. No problem with that. But you can see here, there's not too much yellow shading. The yellow is the shallowest water. There's not too much yellow shading inside of that chute. What happens in a lot of cases, the water is very swift. It's deep. They're not shallow whatsoever for the most part, and so they're a problem. So we call these legacy actions by the agencies. So if we're no longer doing this, we can't leave them just set there without any regard to people that are operating and working along the Missouri River. So we have to address them. We have to fix them. So this next one is interception rearing complexes, or IRCs. I know it's a kind of a mouthful right there. So this is the latest hypothesis for pallid sturgeon. This was signed off on in the record of decision in 2018, again in consultation with the Fish and Wildlife Service. So to give you an idea, I'm not a biologist, don't pretend to be one, but what we've learned in layman's terms is that the female pallid sturgeon will go up to Gavins Point in the spring of the year typically and spawn. And so she'll spawn her eggs in Iowa, Nebraska, somewhere, and then so the larval sturgeon are floating down the river. So the theory is that the main channel of the river is inhospitable toward the larval sturgeon floating along in a little yolk sac at the bottom of the river, or it's in the water column. So the idea is that we need to build 12 of these complexes to see if we can get the larval fish out of the main channel into the side areas, the margin areas of the channel, so they can get bigger, stronger, and maybe not get flushed in the Mississippi River right away. And by the way, we're still determining, the science program is still determining if that is the Mississippi River is a problem or not. They're expanding their monitoring. Is something we've asked them to take the Mississippi River into account. So they're, on the whole, I think we still have a lot of concerns, but the science program is trending in a much better direction than it was previously. I'm trying to keep an idea on the time here. I'm about to wrap up. But you can see here that this color coding here, I talked about the rock structures before. So green, they're proposing to add rock to these structures. Yellow is where they would lower the structures. Consequently, they would put more water into this side channel chute. So again, we've got concerns about flood control. You got a levee over here that you'd be pushing more water into this bank and this levee. So one of the comments that we made on this particular project is that you have to strengthen this bank if you're going to put more water there. You don't want to compromise the levee. They are building these adjacent to public property, but again, you can see on the upper left, there's ag land there on the other side of these trees, and it would flood all that if this levee were compromised. So again, don't have an issue with the IRCs per se. When it starts causing problems for our members' interests out there, that's when we're going to have issues. So again, I covered this November 2018 record decision. So they're building them basically from west central Missouri to the mouth. River mouth 321 is where they found, is the most upstream from the mouth where they found a larval pallid sturgeon. I can't imagine how difficult that would be to find a larval pallid sturgeon in a big river like the Missouri. So hats off to them. But all these are going to be located in our state. So it's a Missouri-specific issue, but who knows where it goes from there? Maybe they start building these further upstream in the future if they're proven successful. I talked about the impacts to navigation. David covered the sand dredging impacts. So still today, his sand dredgers have no idea what the regulatory context is going to be. Is there going to be limitations from new IRCs that are built? They have to stay 200 feet away. They cannot mine 200 feet around a rock structure. So is there going to be limitations on their dredge areas? Something that's a big question mark. I talked about the flood control impacts. So these IRCs are going to be very, very site specific. Every one of them is going to be unique as future sites are constructed. So it's hard for us to do a blanket endorsement especially when we saw previous actions, like I mentioned, in the chutes that were not successful and have led to a lot of problems and are not cleaned up from the past. It's hard to endorse, something, do a blanket endorsement of something new. To the Corps' credit, though, they have worked extensively with the dredging industry, with the navigation industry on addressing our concerns, hearing our questions. So they do deserve quite a bit of credit in this process. So 2 IRCs are currently constructed. USACE is under a current moratorium on building new ones. We requested language in the last water resources bill that requires them to produce a report to Congress on performance of these for human considerations, for flood control, navigation, and also how they're performing for the fish. We think that's we can't just blanketly build these and not be concerned about check in along the way. How are these doing? Until that report gets submitted to Congress, supposed to be submitted this April, no new IRCs can be built. That is all I have, and would welcome your questions. Thank you.
Okay, great, Dan. We'll see if we have some questions come in. Folks, if you want to ask your question, I think you can raise your hand on your computer there, or you could just put a note in the chat window and I will try to unmute you so you can, we've got someone here somewhere. Okay. We've got one person who I believe, let's see. You can ask your question.
Sandy and Dan and David, thank you very much for this. This is Mark Simpson. Can anybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm from Niobrara, Nebraska, and I got a great interest in the river. I am president of the board of directors for MSAC. My question to you guys is, and David, you said that you want the sediment that we've got bottled up here because of the dams. Is there any, from your perspective, ways to get that sediment to you guys? That's the big problem that we're working on with the Corps now. And the other part of the question is, when you remove that sand from the river for the concrete, how far away is that trucked? I'm wondering, because another one of our problems is we don't have a significant population base that can use that for concrete. We would have to ship it somewhere via either rail or truck, and we're trying to figure out if that's feasible. Just would like your comments.
Thanks for the question, Mark. The dams were not designed to move sediment, as you guys know. The National Academy of Science report literally blew off, in spite of 75% of the material being removed, blew off the question, summarily stating that it would be too expensive. I obviously don't agree with that. I think there are interim measures that could be done. The issue all involves hydraulics, obviously, but we really are starting to see questions regarding, are we shortening the life expectancy, especially of the lower dams, as a direct result of the load that either was not properly calculated or has been increased net? I don't have a silver bullet answer. Our longest, my guys might dispute it, but I think our longest haul is probably about 3 hours. So figure, 180 miles, a 200-mile max would be what is being hauled inside the state of Missouri. I don't know where that might line up, but realistically, that's probably the maximum of where we could, if the proper capabilities were there, and it was the proper material is there. We have the luxury of having this river right in the lower river that acts as a machine filtering out the sizing. When we start just looking at dump load, where you've got a, what would you call it, a plume at the end of the, say, the Niobrara, that may not be quality sufficient material without additional processing and additional cost. So it's something the Corps has to study, and we obviously would be supportive of that study.
Thank you very much.
Hey, we did have another question for Dan. Did the diversion north of Atchison for the sturgeon get washed away during last year's flooding?
I don't know about that particular one. I do know that they are still assessing the impacts of the flood to all the Missouri River Recovery Program sites. I would imagine that some of them took a pretty good beating, along with all the rock structures in the river. So that's something I could follow up with you, Sandy, on. We could check into that.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
For whoever needs that. I don't know if you can tell on your end who asked the question.
Yep.
I would just add maybe too on the IRCs. They did say that the two that are constructed right now, and again, this is the restructuring of the rock dikes out there, that they believe that those held up reasonably well under the 2019 event. So that's encouraging, I guess.
I think it's also important to note on that question, to again the Corps' diligence, they have not been able to get in to do proper assessments of all of their structures until about a month ago. They've been working more upstream than downstream right now, and that's why so many non-federal levees are currently impacted down in Missouri. They're just finding out how severely the impacts really were. A lot of the numbers were estimates in our part of the world.
I guess I have a question, and maybe it's more of a comment, but with this legislation that's being discussed and with the objective being flood control, and one of your bullet points mentioned it focused on the lower river, I guess, do you feel politically there may be room to also illustrate that flood control is impacted by how much water storage capacity the reservoirs have?
Oh, absolutely. I think that, Sandy, you and I talked about this, we were preparing for this webinar. Certainly, we can, I think, go back to staff where we've been working with Senator Blunt's office and see if they, want to consider that. I just think on the whole, that, like I mentioned, they were trying to keep it to the lower river to avoid some of those, water fights, if you will, that we've had in the past. I think everyone's well-intentioned, but I do think that, we need to point out that connection. I think when you talk, what's frustrating when you talk to the Army Corps, and I guess it's technically correct, that, they'll say, well, Gavins Point doesn't provide that much flood control. It's the smallest of the system. We know that. But you're taking the smallest bucket and constricting it even further with sediment and making it even smaller. So let's not make it a complete run-of-the-river type project where it has no functionality anymore, because I think today probably about half of our water, if maybe more, is coming from Gavins Point right now, somewhere in there, 40-50% roughly. We have as I mentioned, we have a local engineer that he loves to do that. It's his project, periodically reporting in how he calculates how much of our flow going past our towns in Missouri is from Gavins Point, how much is from elsewhere, from the tributaries. So I think there's an opportunity there to maybe look at Gavins Point in part of the future studies.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And I guess I did have to almost chuckle that one of your comments was that the study isn't about whether you're not looking at whether it flooded or not, or because that's something we run into a lot. Is there's been so many studies done up in this area about sediment, so it's time to do something, I guess, is what we're trying to promote. But I guess as far as what do you see as really helping the flooding situation? Is it higher levees, more levees, or how do you address that down there?
Well, I think it's going to be a combination of a lot of things. And David, you can chime in here too. David's been part of the Missouri Governor's Flood Advisory Recovery Working Group. But it's going to be a combination of things. You know, I mentioned Mr. James and talking with him. He talked about the Mississippi River and tributary system. You know, it was authorized in 1928 after the 1927 flood. So he goes, you know, we've got a series of backwaters. We've got some bayous. We've got you know, floodways. You probably heard a lot about the Bird's Point you know, levee system, where they've got the ability to actually cut the levee if the river gets to be a certain stage to save communities down river. So it's going to be probably looking, I think a lot of our answers could be looking toward the Mississippi River and how they do things in terms, and they've got a federal system all the way to from, you know, roughly south of St. Louis all the way to the Gulf. So there's not going to be an easy answer to it, but we think that our local communities, our local landowners, everybody who lives and works along this river deserves better than what we have right now. David, feel free to add to that.
Well, we have a propensity as a country to live in the world of one size fits all. It's exceptionally convenient. It's exceptionally politically easy, because then you're giving the same thing to every spot. The reality of nature is it's not one size fits all. And to answer your question, Sandy, there are some points in the Missouri River that have to have levees raised. There are some points in the Missouri River that have to have levees lowered. There's some parts in the river that may need no levees in order to give us greater functional capacity as sort of volume of river. So if we continue to want to have the conversation of one size fits all, we're going to end up with the same result, which is some part of this system is going to flood dramatically. And we're not going to have the chances to reduce risk, which is, let's face it, this isn't true flood control. It's trying to keep losses at a minimum. And so some place may flood, but the reality of it is how much can we continue to get reduced risk? And when we look at the system as a whole, even with all the flooding, the amount of reduced risk with regard to the system is incredible. It does serve its purpose. It's just the impacts of a flood like 2019 were never in the real cards. And if they were, they weren't ever completed. So I do think the study will be helpful. But if they sit there and want to do what they've been doing for a long time, we're going to end up in the same kind of scenario. And that's a hard sell politically, so we'll see what happens. The other thing we promoted is the fact that there are a lot of things we can be doing to lessen the damage to levees, even if they flood overtop. Armoring, hardening the levees a lot more in the rural areas. As Dan said, cutting some areas out that we just have to make some business decisions as a country. And you know, our position has been, let's not handcuff ourselves with a premise right out of the chute. Let's have a little more flexibility in that. I do think the federal levy question, at least in the state of Missouri, because that's really where the non-federals are, is one that's a decision that if Missouri had to make again, they would opt into the federal levy system. And so I do think that's a legitimate discussion that has to be broached with Congress. We can't afford to continue to afford on a local level to replace these things. We've had breaches in 5 major floods in the last 30 years. So it's not sustainable financially.
There was another question that came through. What are some ideas for increasing conveyance without levee setbacks?
Well, I'll start with that, and David, you can add to it. But really would involve, I think, some changes to the rock structures on the river. Is not currently funded, but one of the items that's a priority for us is a Missouri River navigation study. So the idea is the navigation system. So the last flow target, the Corps' got a flow target to meet at Kansas City for navigation. Beyond that, it was theorized that the tributaries below it would provide enough natural support. So going back and the study is going to go back and look at, is that really the case? Is it providing the flow support? So where I was going with that is that they found out that for some reason that these dikes, these rock dikes out there, were not built with the width specifications as originally called for. In a lot of cases, they might be 50 feet too short. And so if you look at maybe extending those to their full authorization, it could provide more flow conveyance. So I don't know, there's a lot of controversy too about, we have a lot of these dikes that have been, basically as soon as they went in, have been notched for different conveyance reasons or, habitat restoration purposes. So we have to look at that. What impact or have the dike notches had on conveyance? And I think too, areas that I talked about, from St. Joe roughly to the Platte River where the bottom is coming up, we have to pay attention to that. And there's not going to be easy answers to it, but I know that's really, I mentioned Senator Blunt, we met with him last July. He said that's a big item on his list. How smart people can figure out how to get that done. But he said, I want to do something that we can actually get done while I am in Congress. I don't want to spend 20 years deciding, what we need to do, prolonged fights about things. So I think we can, I don't know, again, not being an engineer, those are some of my thoughts on conveyance. David, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, in particular, north of St. Joe, when you've got two different sets of scientists disagreeing on what would maximize conveyance and what was the problem, it makes it pretty difficult to get a consensus. And what we have is USGS discussing the fact that north of St. Joe, they refer to it as the hump. It exists and it is part of the cause of flooding north of St. Joe. And then the Corps sitting there saying, oh, no, that's not the cause, blah, blah, blah. It makes it very hard for us as just citizens to sit there and say, what policy are you going to set? And then virtually downstream of St. Joe, you've got our community, meaning the dredge community, in a regulatory position where they're complaining that the bed is too low. Well, you got a bed too high, you got a bed too low. What are you going to do about it? Okay. But don't point fingers at what I call the innocents, which are the people that use the river versus the designers who designed the river and put together both the BSNP and the reservoir system. So clearly, we've got to get through some of that geomorphology science where we can get some consensus before we're even going to see some changing with regard to bed development. Personally, my position is there's a hump, and that hump, there's two of them, in fact, as reported by USGS. And for us to be sitting there arguing about bed dynamics not going to equalize themselves is quite ridiculous. The second item of importance is, it's going to sound funny, but roughness. As we continue to add more non-structural related solutions along the river and the MRRP, if you don't keep the material in those non-structural solutions low, they tend to cause sedimentation in the system versus conveyance. And so there's a lot of conversation going on about when the Corps acquires an area for habitat, what should it look like? A lot of us would sit there and say, let it grow up as natural as possible. Well, a lot of us would also sit there and say, well, it's not conveying any water. In fact, what it's doing is building up the river by providing a slowdown of the flow and therefore deposition. So these are science questions, not political questions. And we've got to start getting some more objective science.
Yeah, I would just might add in the conveyance piece, and one of the first governors at flood recovery advisory meetings, Colonel Hudson was there from the Omaha district, and he talked about that, how, you know, the out-of-bank flood events are causing, you know, the river side of the levees to become, the banks to become higher and higher and higher with each event as sediment drops out. And though over time we have lost conveyance along the banks, I'm not saying like we need to do drastic things there, but it is interesting to hear him acknowledge that, and it makes a lot of sense that we have lost some of that conveyance along, you know, with our high banks getting higher over time. So not an easy fix to it.
Another question, what would you think if sediment, fine sand and silt were passed downstream of Gavins Point in large quantities?
David, do you want to take that one?
Well, you know, it's part of a system, and the question is from my guys, the question is, you know, what's the grain size and what's the commercial viability? But when we look at it from a habitat side, the issue becomes, does it improve the habitat with regard to certain fish species, et cetera, et cetera? You know, generally speaking, our position has been we're 75% loss of sediment in this river system downstream of Gavins. So I would have to say that we'd want it. Okay, I don't see a reason why we'd be in a position that we'd be opposed to it. Ideally, it would be great if it was commercially viable material for my dredgers, but the fact is it probably won't be. It'll be too fine. But the fact is it is going to be necessary with regard to habitat development.
Okay. And there was another question about, has the Corps studied loss of reservoir capacity due to siltation, as it seems obvious that the solution is more storage capacity? And I guess I can just say a few things there is that, yes, they have. And for instance, Lewis and Clark Lake behind Gavins Point Dam, by the year 2045, it's estimated that it would be 50% full of sediment. And then the larger reservoirs will take longer to fill. Lewis and Clark Lake being the smallest reservoir would fill the fastest. But there are other issues, and it is part of the annual operating plan in where they estimate what the load is coming into each reservoir. So there is a lifespan consideration to each reservoir. But we know that the impacts and problems associated with sedimentation are felt much sooner than when the reservoir is full. And by that time, it's way too late to do anything. I don't know if you guys have anything to add.
Sandy, real quick, you and I discussed this last week, I think. We had an individual within Missouri DNR that talked about how he didn't believe how the Corps was doing a true accounting for the sedimentation in the system when everyone's seen the graph of system storage. You know, they always say, well, we've got 16.3 million acre feet for flood control storage. Well, that might be true, but you're condensing the layers there. So the carryover pool, multi-purpose and carryover pool, those other layers get flattened, if you will, because overall that sedimentation level in the permanent pool is continuing to come up. So it does put a squeeze on navigation, water supply. I think roughly we've lost about 1 million acre feet out of the system from sedimentation. So yeah, it's something we definitely can't afford to wait. We have to get a handle on for sure.
Another thing I'm curious about is in the legislation, I don't know if the localities or the states had input as far as like the federal cost share, I guess, where are your areas at and how they can contribute to these projects? Is that 20% doable, or how was that arrived at?
I don't know the answer to that, Sandy. I have to get back to you
Okay.
on that. That's not something that we got into great discussions about, you know, and maybe they were just looking at the PL 8499 model for levees, I would imagine, is how that figure, just a guess on my part. It's hard. It's hard for to come up with that 20% match. Like our local levee district, you know, made up of just volunteer assessments on land. It's difficult to do big projects. I know the state of Missouri in the past they've used some community development block grant funding to supplement for the 20% match, but it's very difficult. You know, I don't want to get in a big philosophical debate. I think at some point, I think it's important at some level to have folks to have some of their own financial resources into the game, whatever that level is. You know, that's just my thought. But yeah, it can be a big hurdle.
Okay. Well, is there any other questions or anyone who would just like to offer some comments? We can sure get you unmuted here. I guess I might ask another just general question about Mr. Rick. I know it seemed like when it had begun, was like a total consensus needed for things to happen, and how has that worked or not worked, I guess? I
don't know who wants to go first here, but it is times. But I think, you know, David could comment here in a previous scenario where you had some state organizations that got together, and Missouri was typically, state of Missouri was typically on the outside looking in. So here you have to have, for recommendations go forward to the agencies, you have to have consensus, and that was a big thing that the state of Missouri at the time when the charter was being drafted, I think 2008, 7, and 8, that was a condition that people had to agree. And I think if you object to something in the room that gets floated, you know, it's up to that person that's objecting to really try to come up with a better solution. So it's not perfect, but I think you'd be hard pressed to find. It still, you know, really remains to be one of our best options out there in terms of dialogue with the agencies. Like I say, it's messy at times, but it's just really interesting. It's an interesting opportunity, you know, to hear from people at, you know, Fort Peck, Montana, or the tribes. It's really helped me in my understanding of the different, you know, stakeholder concerns out there from various stretches of the river. But David, do you want to add anything?
Well, I think you're pretty accurate. I mean, I was on what was called MRBA as the state rep during my time when I was State Department of Directors, State Director of the Department of Natural Resources. And the votes were 7-1, 6-2, almost always going against the state of Missouri. And as a direct result, you end up having a scenario where it still ends up being contentious because of the lawsuit potential. So the goal and objective was to try and at least avert some of the massive lawsuits expenditures that were taking place by the states. And it has achieved a large portion of that. I do believe that there have been times when, you know, that split would potentially be a majority, but it wouldn't necessarily be a majority by population. So Mr. Rick presents a scenario where at least you're striving for consensus versus striving for your own interests. And it means you got to give a little bit. So I have found it better than the previous format. I think the dialogue has been much broader and much more enhanced. I can speak for almost everybody in the state of Missouri. Our relationship with the folks from North Dakota has never been better, largely because of Mr. Rick. And that's just a coincidence of where we sit when we're at the panel. But it has been generally positive.
Okay. There has been another question. Has the Corps evaluated the change in conveyance if the bumps were removed? If not, is this a part of the lower Missouri River study?
David, do you want to comment on that?
The answer is I don't know. I do not believe they have evaluated, quote, the bumps from the standpoint of conveyance. I do believe they have evaluated those with respect to areas in which tend to flood higher more often than not. Northwest Missouri tends to get hammered when we have these events, and a large amount is attributed to bed elevation by at least USGS. So the answer is with regard to some aspects, yes. With regard to pure conveyance, my belief is no. And that's my belief.
Okay. I think we've gone a little over an hour, but I was wondering if both of you might just summarize what you think is important just in general for Missouri River management and I guess for the future of the Missouri River and how it can possibly fit everyone's ideal, I guess. How do we achieve that? All these upper basin and lower basin states.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that, Sandy. It's it's an interesting scenario that we all find ourselves in. Things that were laid out generations before us. Used to have steamboat traffic go all the way up to Fort Benton, Montana, and after these devastating floods, decided to build this system of reservoirs, which I think are really unmatched in the whole world. So we have a system in place that some are advocating to change it, that we don't have it right, that we need to go back, do it different. But I don't know. I mean, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and start all over. I think we have to build. It'll be a combination of things, like I mentioned. There's some areas where we can maybe improve levees. Other areas we need to look at, doing some non-structural stuff, where it's locally acceptable. Find ways to maybe a compensation piece for those that have to take on water. I mean, we can figure all these things out. It's going to take us a while. It's going to be messy. And then we can figure out how to restore, the habitat needs too for the species. It maybe sounds Pollyannish, but I think we can do it. I think there's a lot of smart minds here in this basin and elsewhere that can help us get there. And so we have too many assets, too many things at stake just to make big changes and then regret them later. I think so. This is an amazing system, and we have to continue to just build upon it and improve it for the generations going forward. David?
You said the comment to make everybody happy. We're not going to make everybody happy. It's an impossibility on the system. It's the largest river in North America, and we've modified this river in order to solve as many problems as we could. I think one of the things we forget when we look at it is we all talk about the Panama Canal and how wonderful it is. It's a big project. This project, from a standpoint of engineering, is the biggest project. It's not the Panama Canal in terms of engineering expertise. 3 of the largest man-made reservoirs in North America are on this system. Okay, it's an incredible asset. I think we have to acknowledge that when we go into discussions. We've had the system in place a long time. There hasn't been changes to structures like there should have been to adapt to conditions on the river and the lower river. We have issues that are occurring up in your portion, like increased sediment that is above the amount of sediment that was predicted. To sit there and talk about Gavins as strictly being a re-regulating system versus the rest of the reservoirs is, in my opinion, erroneous. We need it downstream. We can't have a pulse coming directly from the large upstream reservoirs without some equalization taking place to cut that pulse. You know, there's lots of issues, but I don't think we've done it because of infighting. I don't think we've done as good a job as adaptive management, which is a wonderful buzzword, but it applies to engineering as much as it applies to wildlife, as much as it applies to business. And we've been very stale with regard to our willingness to adaptively manage the system in order to find better ways. A little bit of change is okay. The big changes that some of these things are being discussed, that have been discussed recently about lowering reservoirs, is actually a radical change. And those conversations are not productive, in my opinion. But there's a lot of things we can do to increase or decrease certain risks. But recognizing that we have to be adaptive. And that includes winter flows on the Middle Mississippi River, by the way. And we wish to ignore that because how documents have been written. But the Middle Miss in 2012, we almost had to lose all production on the largest transportation system in the United States, and because we wouldn't allow more water to come out of Gavins. So I think we have to be more adaptive, and I think that's the only way we're going to be able to cut through this, because, again, one size doesn't fit all, and that's what we want, generally speaking. Thanks.
Well, I appreciate everyone joining us today. And if anyone has any other questions that come up, please send them to us, and I'll see that Dan gets them.